Okay, hi everybody. My name's Dr. Ben Litherland. Today I'm going to be talking you through one of my favourite topics to think about when it comes to media studies and communication and all those other things, and that's to think about the way that audiences use and relate to the media in their everyday lives. So rather than thinking about media texts or the industries that they come from, one of the things that I research is the way that audiences use the media. And I think whilst that can take many kind of routes, and on the module that I normally teach on, we normally kind of go from thinking about media power and the kind of relationship that the media industries have and the responsibilities that the media industries have to their audiences. But one of the big ways of interjecting into those debates, I would say, is beginning to think about, well, how actually do people use the media? And it begins to pose a whole range of different questions. So there's a few things that we're going to do. The first is to kind of think about the way media theorists have conceptualized the everyday, and then on to the kind of meat of today's session, which will take 15 or 20 minutes or so, is to beginning to think about the typology of the different ways that that audiences use the media in their everyday life. And we're going to use this typology that Lola developed, and then in your sessions you're going to apply some of those different ways of thinking about the media. So that's what this short taster session is going to do. First and foremost, then, let's begin to think about and begin to conceptualize the everyday. So like I say, often when we write about and think about the media in relation to audiences, there's a long history, 100 years of history of thinking about media effects, or what we call the media effects model. This idea of the kind of hypodermic needle model, where the media can control what people do. It can kind of have this huge impact. This idea that, you know, advertising can almost brainwash people into buying things that they perhaps don't need or don't want. And there's a long history of kind of seeing audiences in that way. Where I come from as a researcher is the opposite. I don't think the media has that much power, which isn't to say that I don't think the media plays a role in shaping discourse, or that people can use media in their everyday life to reinforce their own values or beliefs, or that they can use the building blocks of the media to help, you know, support or shape particular ideological positions. I'm not saying the media doesn't have any influence at all in society or whatnot, but I am saying that the idea that the media has a very simple, common sense influence and impact on audiences is where I personally differ. What I tend to do is to think about the kind of the role that the media plays in people's social and cultural lives. Even with that, though, I think often media studies scholars and communication scholars can overplay the centrality and importance of media in people's lives, which is understandable. If you've spent your whole life studying something or thinking about something, it's understandable that you might go, well, this is clearly very important and very critical for people's lives. But I take my launching pad as Nick Couldry, who's one of the UK's top media scholars. I've really been influenced by this idea that we as researchers shouldn't assume that the media are the most important things in people's lives. In fact, a problem with media studies is that it often seems to assume this. Instead, my approach, and this is also kind of building on culture in my approach as well as a researcher, my approach is grounded in the analysis of everyday action and habit. So rather than kind of starting with the media and working out, what Couldry does a really good job of kind of laying out here is that we should do the opposite. We should visit people's lives and experiences and say, okay, what do your everyday lives look like? And then from there, we should go, okay, and how does the media slot into this? So the section that I'm looking today is taken from a broader lecture where we begin to think about and kind of break up the question of, okay, so what do people do with the media in their everyday lives? And I think once you start posing that question as opposed to posing the question, what influence does the media have on people, and start saying, how do people use the media in their everyday lives? The answers that we come up with are quite different, actually. Those two, that slight difference of approach and question, once you start posing those questions, it can generate radically different answers. And that introduction to what some of those answers might look like, and hopefully the conversations and discussions that you'll continue in your sessions on the other side of the world, will help you kind of think about, okay, so what's happening with the media. To do that, what I'm going to do, I really like this typology, because I think it begins to capture some of those nuances, and it begins to capture some of the ways that I think about the media, and when I'm researching media audiences, the things that I'm influenced by. What I'm going to do is talk you through Lull's typology. There's a couple of caveats. So the references that I've been using, in which you might have access to via kind of your own libraries and by the University of Huddersfield libraries, you can chase up the references to this. But the couple of caveats. So this is an old theory in many ways. Lull was writing about this in the 80s and 90s. So he was writing for a different mediated era. This is a mostly pre-internet, mostly pre-streaming era. Clearly he's writing about Western/British audiences. He was specifically thinking about a domestic environment in a particular historical moment. I think that's important to say. He was talking about houses in the 1980s and 90s, as well as television in the 90s, 80s and 90s. One of the things that you might want to do in your sessions is to think about whether this still applies in a kind of Chinese context. That might be an interesting way of approaching this. But with those caveats to one side, he's writing about a particular domestic setup, and he's writing about a particular mediated setup. I still think a lot of these things that he raises about the way that audiences and users use the media in their everyday lives are transnational. I think they hold up across a lot of nations and countries and parts of the world. I still think that you'll see bits of this that you recognize in your own life. And I still think, despite it being written about television, they still hold up for a lot of other types of mediated content. And certainly what I'm going to try and do in the session is point to and indicate and illustrate that even though this was written about television in a different historical era, I still think you can apply this to, say, Netflix and or Spotify and or social media. Whatever it is, I think there's elements of this that continue, and I think that's worthwhile that we continue those discussions. So when Lull was thinking and writing about the way that people use television in their everyday life in a particular type of family home or domestic space, he came up with these different ways of the types of use that people have. The first is environment, the second is regulation, the third is communication facilitation, the fourth is affiliation and avoidance, the fifth is social learning, and the final one is competence and dominance. Don't worry if you don't know what those mean immediately, that's totally fine. What we're going to do for the next 10 or 15 minutes is just talk you through what some of these are and give you examples of what they are. And hopefully when I finish this recording and you're doing the kind of group work and the work after this, you can begin to apply, okay, you can begin to ask yourself, do you do any of these in your own everyday lives? Do you recognize the way that media is being used by certain types of audiences? Right, okay. So the first then is environment. Put broadly in this concept, so rather than using the television to sit down and dedicatedly watching a TV show, Lowell found when he spoke to people about what they do when the television on is, that often they just put it on as background noise, and they put it on to help regulate the environment that they are in. So it's not necessarily that they're sitting down to be entertained. They might have it on just to feel like they've got company, or they might stick it on in order to sometimes not have silence. It's as simple as that. And again, I think you can see evidence of that. And certainly when we do empirical research on this topic, whenever we speak to people about the types of media that they use and how they use it in their everyday, this repeatedly comes up. Pink and Mackley in 2013, for instance, in some of their research, found that they were concerned with how media is situated as part of the routine, habitual, tacit, normally unspoken sensitivities of everyday life in the home. This refers in part to how people use media content consciously to create the sensory and experiential environment of home. Yeah, our main focus is how through mundane and not usually spoken about routines of everyday living, media are a game for affective and embodied ways of making the home feel right, which I think is really important. So even in the kind of last 5, 6, 7 years when people have been doing research, this continues to be a thing. When I do this lecture and I've got a room full of 18 or 19-year-olds, I ask the question, who falls to sleep in the evening with either a podcast on, the television on, or with music on? Who sets a timer and falls to sleep with those sounds, whether those are relaxing sounds or the kind of sounds of the television? And often I'd say between half and 3/4 of the room of people will put their hand up. They'll say, yeah, I can't go to sleep without some form of media playing in the background. And that really captures this sense of kind of environment that Lowell is talking about, that people use the media in a variety of ways to make the home feel kind of comfortable or relaxing or soothing. An example I give, again, whether this is something that you recognize or not, but this is one of my favorite YouTube channels, which is called Hip Hop Study Beats. The laptop that I'm working on, I've got a sticker of the little girl on the back of my laptop. But this is something when I'm working and increasingly working from home, I'll put this on. And it's just kind of quite relaxing, soothing sounds and music that doesn't have lyrics. It doesn't have sound. So you can sort of just have it on in the background and it just helps ease the kind of sounds over it. And that would be an example of me personally using the media to kind of create a comfortable environment for me to work in. That's an example that I give from my own everyday life. And of course, you can study the kind of power dynamics of how a YouTube channel exists, but realistically, for the users, for the kind of audiences, it's background stuff that's happening. The second of Lowell's typology is regulation, which gets into a kind of slightly more interesting set of questions about the way the media is used to regulate our everyday life. What Lowell is specifically talking about here is an interesting question as to whether this still exists. And I would argue that it still does exist, but perhaps it operates in a slightly different way. So for Lowell, and this is the task that I've set you in the groups, for Lowell, television is used in a regulative capacity to organise household time and the everyday routines of family life. This contributes to the structuring of the day and also the maintenance of family and household relations. So you can see a really good example of this if you pick up a kind of British television guide, so a TV guide would list all the types of shows that are going to be on at that day at a given time. It's not something that I personally use, but certainly my grandparents still get a weekly TV guide and they kind of sit and highlight all the things that they're going to be watching. But the significant thing for us here is the way that television is regulating our experience. In simple terms, breakfast TV introduces you to the day, whereas in the evening, there's a point where kind of the interesting television stops and the repeats start. It's kind of gently nudging you to go to bed. Even from the kind of bottom up, when I was growing up, you'd be allowed a certain amount of TV per evening, and then once a certain television ended, that was time to go to bed. So you were allowed to watch something, and then once the TV show ended, that was it. That was bedtime. So this is an example of again, audiences and users of the media using the raw materials of the television guide to help just structure the family kind of life, family experience. And again, you might kind of recognize that from your own life. What I use to illustrate this, often thinking about this historically, is quite interesting. British television, when it first started, there was quite a lot of anxiety about how television might distract from the kind of family household. So the BBC came up with a solution between 6 and 7, between the years 1946 and 1956, and the time 6 and 7 p.m. in the evening, there was this thing that was informally called the toddler's truce, which was so television wouldn't be on, it'd be switched off for an hour nationally. The BBC, the national broadcast, would switch off the television in order to help parents, and obviously that was kind of mothers. There was a gendered job, gendered labour there. But more often than not, mothers were supposed to kind of put down the children. And so television was seen as playing a role in the kind of national daily life and daily experience. And again, whilst it might not be as strict as that, we don't switch off the TV in Britain between 6 and 7 p.m. from an official viewpoint. We still might use the kind of TV to regulate our, chores and our labour. We might put the TV on for half an hour in the morning to help us to kind of distract the kids in order for us to do kind of domestic chores or whatever it is, whatever the kind of setup is. But the TV's playing a role just there in regulating our experience of time. The third is communication facilitation. So this is quite simply that whilst we might kind of think about the television as dominating family life, what often happens is that television provides opportunities for people to talk together, to come together. It provides us and gives us something to talk about. So you might see an episode of your favorite TV show, and whilst it's on, it's constantly giving you material of things to just have a chat about. It facilitates talking and communication. One of my personal favorite TV shows, British TV shows, is called The Royal Family. And it's royal with an E, so it's not like the royal family in the kind of king and queen. It's the royal is the family name, and it's a working class family in Manchester. So I work in Huddersfield, but I live in Manchester, and it reminds me a little bit of my family life growing up. It's an older TV show. So what the TV show is, it's a comedy about a working class family watching television. So it's a little bit meta. And I think it's just a really good illustration of the way, families, whilst ostensibly and technically they're watching television, really they're not. The television's on in the background. What the television's doing is it's giving an opportunity for people to get together and have a chat about things. Gives us a kind of opportunity to agree and to disagree and have debates and figure out what's going on in the world and all those types of things. As a continuation of that, and as a kind of secondary way of thinking about that, the fourth part of the typology is the media in everyday life, particularly in domestic and family settings, is it creates different types of affiliation and avoidance. So this is perhaps something that you might recognize, that you might go, okay, I've got my own bedroom, and it's in my bedroom that I go and kind of that's where I try and get out of the family kind of life. Where I just want some alone time or some private time. Or even if you've got a shared bedroom, you might go, I'm sitting on my phone, and that's where I find space for myself. Also, you might kind of come together. So you might have kind of in a domestic setting, I don't know, the father and son might be watching football or a kind of whatever the sport is on, the kind of popular sport, whereas the mother and daughter might go to a different room to do something else at different times. So the media is just kind of creating these different kind of ways of coming together for certain for certain programs or certain moments in the day, but also giving you opportunity to kind of avoid one another, because there's opportunity to be like, okay, we spent the whole day together. We're now going to go watch different programs in different rooms. You know, with all the complexities that has. I say this, giving this lecture, we're now 8.5 weeks into social isolation. So I've barely left the house in 8.5 weeks. So I really feel the pains of the role that the media plays in creating kind of opportunities for me and my partner to come together, but also for us to find our own space. So I've been watching the Michael Bull's NBA basketball documentary, which my girlfriend isn't interested in, so she will go and watch something else entirely, and we'll have, you know, a couple of hours alone just to get to grips together. And those are all just kind of interesting examples of the affiliation and avoidance that media can bring us together, and, you know, just help us to find our own space in our everyday lives. Social learning, and this is an interesting one. So what we'll find is, rather than the media kind of brainwashing children, what we'll find is that the parents use the media to help educate children, to help sort of reinforce particular types of family values, or to say, this is who we are, these are the types of things that we do, these are the types of relationships that we have, and so on. So, you know, this can be as simple as sticking a child in front of a television show, and a television show that you trust. But more generally, so these illustrations are examples of research that I've done with families and family units. So this was of little girls who dress as Rey from the Star Wars trilogy, the last Star Wars trilogy. And what we found was that families were watching Star Wars together, and they were chatting about things, and they were watching and playing together in the family home, and then the little girls would dress up as Rey from this. And this is from a paper that I published with Rachel Wood and Elizabeth Reed in Cultural Studies last year. And what we found was that the types of cultural consumption that the families were doing, it was an attempt of trying to kind of control future outcomes for the girls, of building kind of resilience and other things like that. It was a way of building a kind of family identity. So what the television does in kind of everyday life is it creates a type of social learning. It creates a way of narrating family life, I think, of illustrating family life, of building stuff. Last but not least, we've got the section on kind of competence and dominance. So this is always an interesting one. Again, for in a lecture theatre, I'd ask the question, in your family household growing up, or if you're still living with parents, who got the remote control? And I'd go through the different options of, like, is it your mum? Does your mum normally sit with the remote control in hand? Is it your dad? Is it an older sibling? Is it a younger sibling? Is it a grandmother, grandfather? Is it somebody else? And what I think that illustrates and demonstrates is this interesting thing that actually who gets to decide what's on the television is a way of, like, quite micro competence and dominance in the family household. The person in control of the household often, although not always, gets the remote. They get to decide what they're watching. And remember, this is in a particular historical moment and a particular mediated environment. So this is particularly about television. But again, I think this can be expanded out of who knows how to work the television, who knows how to work the computer. What does that tell us about the kind of dynamic, the power dynamics in the family household? If a grandmother doesn't necessarily know how to log on to use the email and the grandchildren do, what does that do for that social relationship? And again, you can expand this outwards, and even in an era of streaming and those other things, that question of, like, maybe not who gets the remote control, but who gets to decide which TV show we're going to watch now? Who gets to decide whether we're going to watch TV, full stop? It just illustrates the types of relationships that are facilitated by the media. The role that the media plays in everyday life isn't necessarily, it's not about what's on the television, it's about who gets to decide what is on in the television. If you come at this from a kind of social angle, it raises different questions. And I think all of that typology is really interesting, that if you develop your own media diaries, and that's one of the tasks that you're going to be asked to do. If you develop your own media diaries, all of a sudden you can see these different types of relationships and these different types of experiences coming through them. And that's why I think that the typology is so interesting, for kind of raising interesting questions about the role that the media plays in our everyday life. So those are the references that I've been using. It's been nice to kind of record this for you and hopefully raise some of the interesting questions that you will be doing at the University of Huddersfield. And then you've got tasks that will help build on this that I've distributed as a separate Word document. So good luck with those, and I hope you enjoy them, and stay safe and take care.